North Africa, 1943. The battlefield is hot, dusty, and brutally unforgiving. American soldiers are moving through terrain where every ridge can hide an enemy machine gun, every ruined building can conceal an anti-tank gun, and every German armored vehicle can turn a quiet road into a death trap. Then something strange happens. An American soldier raises a weapon that looks almost ridiculous. It isn't a rifle. It isn't a machine gun. It isn't a conventional cannon. It is a tube. A simple steel launcher designed to fire a small rocket. To some German soldiers it looks crude. Almost too crude. But the Americans aren't trying to impress anyone. They're trying to destroy tanks. The weapon is the M1 rocket launcher, the weapon that would become famous as the bazooka. And within months, the Germans would discover something uncomfortable. That simple American tube could put a rocket-powered anti-tank weapon into the hands of ordinary infantrymen. The Germans already had powerful anti-tank guns. They had artillery. They had mines. They had increasingly sophisticated tanks. But the Americans had found a different answer. Give the infantry a rocket. And then give that rocket enough explosive power to threaten an armored vehicle. The concept was simple. The battlefield consequences were anything but. And the story that followed would become one of the most fascinating examples of wartime technological imitation. Because when German forces captured American rocket launchers in North Africa, German engineers didn't simply throw them into a warehouse. They studied them. They tested them. They examined the ammunition. And eventually they created their own much larger weapon. The result became known as the Panzerschreck, literally the tank terror. The story is sometimes told as if German soldiers laughed at the American bazooka, only to copy it after realizing how effective it was. The exact laughing anecdote is difficult to document as a universal German reaction, but the underlying story is real. The Germans captured American rocket launcher technology, recognized its potential, and rapidly developed a larger German weapon around the same basic principle. And that story tells us something important about World War II. The war wasn't simply a contest between tanks, airplanes, battleships, and factories. It was a contest of ideas. And sometimes the weapon that changed the battlefield wasn't the most complicated one. Sometimes it was the simplest. A tube, a rocket, a soldier, and a target. The problem with tanks. By the early years of World War II, tanks had transformed warfare. Armor allowed troops to cross ground under protection. A tank could smash through obstacles, carry a cannon, and survive small arms fire that would kill exposed infantry. But tanks created a huge problem for infantry. How do you stop one? The traditional answer was the anti-tank gun. Put a powerful cannon on a carriage. Aim it at the enemy tank. Fire an armor-piercing shell. The idea worked, but there was a problem. Anti-tank guns were heavy, they had to be moved. They needed crews. They needed ammunition. And once they fired, the enemy knew where they were. An infantry unit moving through a village could not simply carry a large anti-tank cannon from house to house. The battlefield demanded something smaller, something portable, something that could be carried by soldiers who were already carrying rifles, ammunition, grenades, food, water, and everything else required to survive combat. The answer would eventually come from rockets. Rockets had a major advantage. Unlike a conventional gun, a rocket could propel itself after leaving the launcher. That meant the launcher didn't need to absorb the same kind of recoil as a conventional cannon. This opened the door to a completely different category of weapon. A lightweight launcher could fire a relatively powerful explosive projectile. The concept wasn't uniquely American. The Germans themselves had extensive experience with military rockets. The Soviet Union had developed the famous Katyusha rocket systems. Germany operated the Nebelwerfer family of rocket artillery. Rockets were already proving their value. But there was a difference. The bazooka was designed around the individual infantryman. It brought rocket propulsion down to the squad level. That was the breakthrough. The American army didn't need every infantryman to become an artilleryman. It needed a small team carrying a weapon that could move with the infantry. And that weapon had to be simple enough to operate under combat conditions. The result was the bazooka. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't particularly intimidating from a distance. But it was portable. And portability was power. The American bazooka. The American M1 rocket launcher entered combat during World War II as part of the Army's effort to give infantrymen a portable anti-tank capability. The weapon consisted essentially of a launcher tube, firing mechanism, sights, and supporting equipment. The projectile was propelled by a rocket motor. The launcher itself did not need to function like a conventional cannon. That was the magic of the design. The rocket generated its own thrust. The soldier's job was to aim the weapon, fire it, and get out of the way. The name, bazooka, itself came from an unlikely source. American troops associated the long tube with a musical instrument used by comedian Bob Burns. The nickname stuck. And soon, Bazooka became one of the most recognizable names in infantry anti-tank warfare. But there was nothing funny about what it could do. The early weapon wasn't a magic tank killer. It had limitations. Its effective range was limited. Its accuracy depended heavily on the operator. Its rocket could be affected by battlefield conditions. And early versions did not provide infantry with a guaranteed answer against every armored vehicle. Still, the weapon represented a major shift. An infantryman could now carry a launcher capable of delivering a shape-charge warhead against armored targets. The principle behind the warhead was crucial. Instead of relying solely on enormous kinetic energy to punch through armor, the shaped charge concentrated explosive energy into a focused jet capable of penetrating armor. That meant the rocket didn't have to be enormous. The weapon could remain relatively compact. And this was precisely what made the system interesting to anyone studying it. The Americans had found a way to turn a specialized anti-tank capability into something infantry could carry. That mattered enormously in close terrain. In forests, in villages, in hedgerows, in rubble. In places where a large anti-tank gun was difficult to position, a bazooka team could hide, wait up, fire, and disappear. That was the tactical idea. But the Germans were about to discover it from the other side, North Africa. In 1943, the war in North Africa was reaching its final stages. American forces were gaining experience against German troops who had spent years fighting across Europe and North Africa. The Germans had developed a reputation for battlefield improvisation. Their engineers studied captured weapons. Their soldiers examined enemy equipment. And intelligence officers were constantly looking for technologies that could be copied, improved, or countered. Then German forces obtained something extremely valuable, an American rocket launcher. According to historical accounts, German troops captured American bazooka-type equipment in North Africa. For German engineers, the weapon presented an interesting question. Why was the American launcher so light? Why did it not require a heavy gun carriage? How could the rocket carry the explosive charge without the launcher absorbing conventional gun recoil? And most importantly, could the idea be made more powerful? The answer would be yes. But there was an important detail. The Germans didn't simply make an exact copy. They developed their own version. And they enlarged the concept. The American bazooka fired a rocket of roughly 2.36 inches in diameter in its early form. The German weapon used a much larger projectile. The Panzerschreck's rocket was approximately 88 millimeters. That difference was significant. The German launcher became a much more imposing weapon. The Americans had created a portable rocket launcher. The Germans looked at the idea and essentially asked, what if we make it bigger? The German answer. The German weapon became the Raketen Panzerbuchs 43. Its nickname was Panzerschreck, tank terror. And if the American bazooka looked like a long tube, the Panzerschreck looked like the tube had been turned into a serious battlefield weapon. It was larger. It fired a heavier rocket. And it delivered a powerful shape-charge warhead capable of threatening heavily armored vehicles. The first versions had an important problem. The weapon produced dangerous exhaust gases when fired. The rear of the launcher was open because the rocket's propulsion gases needed somewhere to escape. But that meant the operator could be exposed to the rocket's exhaust. The Germans had to deal with this problem. The Panzerschreck became associated with protective equipment for the operator, including a distinctive shield on later versions. That shield wasn't merely decorative. It helped protect the gunner from the intense blast and exhaust produced when the weapon fired. And now the battlefield had something new. A German infantryman could carry a weapon capable of threatening armored vehicles without dragging a heavy anti-tank gun behind him. The Germans had taken an American concept and developed it into something larger. And that was where the relationship between the two weapons became particularly interesting. The Panzerschreck was not simply a copy. It was a German adaptation. The concept was similar. The execution was different. And the tactical consequences were enormous. Why the Americans needed it? To understand why this mattered, imagine being an American infantryman in Europe. You're moving through a village. The street is narrow. Buildings rise on both sides. Your unit knows German armor could be nearby. Then a tank appears. You don't have time to wait for artillery. You don't have time to bring a heavy anti-tank gun forward. You need something now. That's where the bazooka became valuable. The weapon gave infantry a new option. Not a guaranteed victory. Not a perfect weapon. An option. The difference is important. The presence of a bazooka changed the tactical calculations around an infantry position. A German tank could no longer assume that small arms fire was the only threat coming from an infantry squad. A concealed soldier might be carrying a rocket launcher. A building could hide a bazooka team. A hedgerow could conceal a gunner. A ruined street could become an ambush point. The weapon transformed the relationship between infantry and armor. And the Germans understood this very well, because German tanks faced the same problem, the psychology of armor. Armor has always been partly about psychology. A tank isn't only a machine, it is a moving wall. It creates fear. Infantrymen know that bullets may bounce from its armor. They know the tank's machine guns can sweep their positions. They know its cannon can destroy a building in seconds. But every armored vehicle has a weakness. And once infantry have a portable weapon capable of attacking that weakness, the psychological equation changes. Suddenly the tank commander has to worry about windows, second floors, basements, side streets, tree lines, ditches, and every dark opening. The tank is still powerful, but it is no longer psychologically invulnerable. The bazooka helped create that effect. The Panzerschreck amplified it. German soldiers had a weapon that could attack Allied armor at much greater distances than many infantry anti-tank weapons of earlier generations. The battlefield became more dangerous for tanks. And the answer was not simply thicker armor. It was also tactics. Tank commanders became more cautious. Infantry support became more important. Armored vehicles avoided entering confined areas without infantry nearby. And the contest between armor and anti-armor weapons accelerated. The tank was evolving. So was the rocket launcher. The shot that changed the balance. A shape-charge anti-tank rocket didn't need to travel at extreme speed like a traditional armor-piercing shell. His purpose was different. The warhead was designed so that, when it detonated against armor, the explosive geometry created an intense focused effect. The result could penetrate armor and send lethal fragments and energy into the fighting compartment. For the crew inside a tank, the danger wasn't always the dramatic Hollywood image of the entire tank exploding. Sometimes the effect was much more brutal and much less spectacular. Armor could be penetrated. Fragments could ricochet inside. Ammunition could ignite. Fuel could catch fire. Crew members could be wounded or killed. And even if the tank survived, it could be disabled. That distinction matters. Anti-tank warfare wasn't always about blowing the enemy vehicle into pieces. Sometimes victory meant stopping it, breaking its track, destroying its engine, killing or forcing out the crew, or simply convincing the crew that continuing forward was suicidal. A portable rocket launcher gave infantry another way to achieve that, and the Germans recognized it. The Panzerschreck enters the war. The Panzerschreck appeared in 1943. Its development represented a classic wartime pattern. One side introduces a new capability. The other side studies it. Then the second side develops a response. But in this case, the response wasn't designed to defeat the weapon. It was designed to reproduce its battlefield concept. The German army had already experimented extensively with rocket technology. That meant German engineers didn't have to begin from zero. They understood rockets. They understood shaped charges. They understood artillery. What the American system demonstrated was how those technologies could be combined into a portable infantry weapon. That was the important idea. And the Germans moved quickly. The resulting Panzerschreck was heavier and more cumbersome than the bazooka. But it had a major advantage. Its larger rocket could deliver tremendous anti-armor capability. And suddenly, German infantry could carry a weapon that posed a serious threat to Allied tanks. The American innovation had effectively crossed the battlefield. The Germans had captured the idea. Then they made it their own. The weapon had a cost. But the Panzerschreck wasn't perfect. No weapon was. The larger rocket meant a larger launcher. The weapon was cumbersome. The exhaust was dangerous. The operator needed training. And firing the weapon created a visible and audible signature. The moment the rocket left the launcher, everyone nearby knew something had happened. The gunner had to think about what happened next. Because if the rocket missed, the tank was still alive. And now the tank crew knew where the anti-tank team was. This created a terrifying sequence. Spot the tank, find a firing position, wait, fire, and immediately relocate. That last part could be the difference between life and death. The Panzerschreck's blast and smoke could reveal the gunner. The weapon therefore demanded discipline. It wasn't enough to have a powerful rocket. The soldier had to know how to use it. And the same was true of the bazooka. The technology changed the possibilities. Training determined whether those possibilities became battlefield results. The myth of the laughing Germans. This is where the popular story becomes especially interesting. The headline says, German crews laughed at the American rocket launcher. Then they built their own. It's a great story. It has everything a wartime legend needs. Confidence, humiliation, surprise, and revenge through engineering. But history is usually messier. There is no reliable evidence that German soldiers universally laughed at the bazooka as some kind of useless joke. The German military already understood rockets. They had the Nebelwerfer. They had extensive rocket research. So the idea that German engineers were completely shocked by the existence of a rocket launcher would be misleading. What is much better supported is this. German forces captured American rocket launchers. German authorities recognized their value. And German engineers developed a larger weapon based on the same basic concept. That is the real story. And honestly, the real story may be more impressive, because it demonstrates something that happens repeatedly in military history. A weapon doesn't need to be revolutionary in every component to be revolutionary in combination. The bazooka didn't invent rockets. It didn't invent shaped charges. It didn't invent anti-tank weapons. But it combined existing technologies into a portable infantry system. That combination was powerful enough to influence the enemy. And that is why the Germans copied the concept. The Sherman problem. Now imagine the problem from the American side. American armored formations were built around the M4 Sherman and other vehicles. The Sherman was produced in enormous numbers. It was reliable. It was mobile. It could be maintained in large formations. And it could be supported by a huge industrial system. But numbers didn't make every tank invulnerable. German forces increasingly fielded tanks and anti-tank guns capable of defeating Shermans under the right conditions. Then came German infantry weapons. The Panzerschreck gave German infantry a portable weapon that could threaten American armored vehicles. That meant the Sherman had to fight on two levels. It had to worry about German tanks and anti-tank guns. But it also had to worry about German infantry. A tank crew could defeat another tank. But if hostile infantry got close enough with a rocket launcher, the engagement could become just as dangerous. This was why combined arms mattered. Tanks needed infantry. Infantry needed tanks. Artillery needed to suppress enemy positions. Aircraft could disrupt movement. Engineers cleared obstacles. Every weapon became part of a larger system. The rocket launcher was powerful. But it wasn't a war-winning weapon by itself. The battlefield becomes a hunt. By the time Allied armies were fighting across Western Europe, anti-tank warfare had become a hunt. Tanks hunted anti-tank guns. Anti-tank guns hunted tanks. Infantry hunted tanks. And tanks hunted infantry. A concealed rocket team might wait patiently for the right target. The most dangerous moment was often not when the tank was far away. It was when the tank came close. At close range, armor could be attacked from angles that reduced the advantage of frontal protection. Urban areas made this even more dangerous. A tank moving down a street had limited visibility. The crew could not see everything. A rocket team could hide behind a wall until the last possible second. Then the launcher would appear. The rocket would ignite. The tank commander would have only moments to react. This was the nightmare scenario. The tank's armor might be strong. His gun might be powerful. But the crew couldn't shoot what it couldn't see. And that lesson would continue far beyond World War II. The Panzerschreck's reputation. The Panzerschreck became one of Germany's most recognizable infantry anti-tank weapons. It was powerful enough to threaten many Allied armored vehicles. It could be carried by infantry. And unlike a heavy anti-tank gun, it could be moved through difficult terrain. But it also created logistical problems. The launcher was heavy. The rockets were bulky. The gunner needed protective equipment. And firing the weapon produced a tremendous blast. The German army therefore used different anti-tank weapons according to circumstance. The Panzerschreck was one tool among many. There were anti-tank guns, mines, Panzerfaust, tank destroyers, tanks themselves, and artillery. The Panzerfaust in particular would become another important German infantry anti-tank weapon. Unlike the reloadable Panzerschreck, the Panzerfaust was essentially a disposable single-shot weapon. This created an interesting contrast. The Panzerschreck was closer to a reusable rocket launcher. The Panzerfaust was simpler. And Germany's late-war battlefield increasingly relied on simple weapons that could be produced and distributed under enormous pressure. Why simple one? There is a lesson hidden in this story. Military technology often moves in the direction of complexity. More armor, more electronics, more powerful engines, more sophisticated sights, more advanced fire control. But war also rewards simplicity. The bazooka was simple enough to carry. The Panzerschreck was simple enough to produce and deploy compared with a full anti-tank gun. The Panzerfaust was even simpler. And this simplicity had strategic value. A soldier could be trained to use the weapon. A factory could produce it. A unit could transport it. An infantry formation could carry it. And suddenly a capability that once belonged to specialized artillery units became available to ordinary soldiers. That is a massive change. The tank had once been the hunter. Now every hedgerow could contain a hunter of its own. The rocket and the factory. The story of the bazooka and Panzerschreck is also a story about industrial power. A weapon is only useful if an army can produce enough of it. The United States had enormous industrial capacity. American factories were producing tanks, aircraft, trucks, artillery, ammunition, ships, and small arms on a staggering scale. The bazooka fit into this industrial ecosystem. It was not a one-off prototype. It became a fielded infantry weapon. The Germans faced a different situation. By the later years of the war, German industry was under immense pressure. Allied bombing was damaging factories and transportation networks. Raw materials were increasingly difficult to obtain. Fuel was scarce. The German military was fighting on multiple fronts. That made simple weapons especially attractive. A weapon that could provide a powerful battlefield effect without requiring the resources of a large artillery system could be extremely valuable. The Panzerschreck therefore wasn't merely a technological response. It was also an industrial response. A way to put anti-armor power into infantry formations while Germany's strategic position was deteriorating. The sound of the rocket. Imagine standing behind one. You know the rocket is loaded. You know there is a tank ahead. You raise the launcher. The sight settles. The target fills the view. And then, fire. The rocket leaves the tube. The launcher erupts with smoke and flame. The air behind the gunner becomes a dangerous blast zone. For a fraction of a second, the world becomes noise. Then the rocket reaches the target. Impact. The shape charge warhead detonates. Inside the tank, the crew has no idea what will happen next. Maybe the armor holds. Maybe the rocket hits an angle. Maybe it penetrates. Maybe the tank keeps moving. Maybe the engine dies. Maybe ammunition catches fire. Maybe the crew abandons the vehicle. This uncertainty was the real power of the weapon. The tank commander could never know which infantryman was carrying a launcher. Every suspicious movement mattered. Every window mattered. Every patch of vegetation mattered. The rocket launcher transformed the battlefield into a place of uncertainty. The American response. The Americans didn't simply stop developing their own rocket systems. The bazooka evolved. Improved versions appeared. The M9 and M9A1 were more advanced than the earliest M1. The weapon's sights, launcher construction, and overall handling improved. And as German armor became heavier, anti-tank weapons had to become more capable. This was an arms race in miniature. German armor improved. American armor improved. German anti-tank guns improved. American anti-tank weapons improved. German infantry weapons improved. American infantry weapons improved. Every improvement created another problem. Every problem created another engineering project. And the cycle continued. This is how wars accelerate technology. Not because engineers sit in laboratories imagining the future, but because soldiers are confronted with immediate problems. A tank is too hard to penetrate. Build a stronger weapon. The weapon is too heavy. Make it lighter. The rocket is too weak. Make the warhead stronger. The launcher is too dangerous. Protect the operator. The range is too short. Improve the projectile. War turns engineering into an emergency. The difference between copy and adaptation. The Panzerschreck is sometimes described simply as the German copy of the bazooka. That description is convenient, but it doesn't tell the whole story. The Germans did not simply reproduce every dimension and component. They adapted the concept. The American launcher used a particular rocket and system. The Germans used their own larger rocket. The American weapons battlefield philosophy remained relatively lightweight. The German system became significantly heavier, and the Germans developed protective measures around the launcher. That distinction matters because it shows how technological imitation really works. Countries rarely copy a weapon perfectly. They take what they consider useful. They remove what they don't need. They enlarge what they think is too weak. They modify it to fit their own manufacturing system. They adapt it to their doctrine. And eventually, the new weapon becomes something different. The Panzerschreck was inspired by the American concept, but it became a German weapon. And the same thing happened repeatedly during World War II. The battlefield became a giant laboratory. Every army was watching. Every army was learning. Every army was stealing ideas. The bazooka's bigger legacy. The bazooka's importance went beyond World War II. Portable anti-tank rocket launchers became a defining category of infantry weapons. The concept survived. It evolved. And eventually, the world would see increasingly sophisticated descendants. Recoilless rifles. Rocket-propelled grenades. Guided anti-tank missiles. Man-portable anti-armor systems. The technology became more advanced, but the fundamental question remained the same. How do you give a soldier the ability to defeat an armored vehicle without giving that soldier a massive cannon? The bazooka offered one answer. Put the explosive warhead on a rocket. Let the rocket generate its own thrust. Make the launcher portable. Give the infantryman the ability to attack armor. It was an elegant solution to an enormous problem. And once armies understood the concept, there was no going back. The Germans were learning too. The Germans' reaction demonstrates another reality of war. Technological superiority is never permanent. The United States could invent something. Germany could capture it. Germany could modify it. The Soviet Union could develop something else. The British could create another response. And suddenly, the battlefield became a competition between ideas. The best weapon was not always the weapon with the most advanced engineering. Sometimes it was the weapon that could be built fastest. Sometimes it was the weapon that could be carried farther. Sometimes it was the weapon that could be produced in the greatest numbers. And sometimes it was the weapon that forced the enemy to change his behavior. The bazooka did all of those things. The Panzerschreck did too. The cost of learning. But there was another side to this technological race. Every new weapon was tested by human beings. Not laboratory mannequins. Not computer simulations. Soldiers. The man carrying the launcher had to expose himself. He had to get close enough to the enemy. He had to remain calm while an armored vehicle approached. He had to fire accurately. And after firing he had to survive the response. That required courage. The rocket launcher gave infantry more power, but it did not remove fear. In fact, it may have concentrated it. A soldier with a bazooka knew exactly what he was being asked to do. Wait until the tank is close enough. Aim at the vulnerable area. Fire. And hope. The German Panzerschreck gunner faced the same terrifying reality. The weapon was powerful. But power doesn't make a battlefield safe. The tank crew's nightmare. Now look at the same battlefield from inside a tank. The world is different. You are surrounded by armor. Your machine feels invincible. But visibility is terrible. The tank commander has a limited view. The gunner is focused on a target. The driver sees only what his position allows. The crew communicates through intercoms and gestures. Outside, enemy infantry are everywhere. And now you know they might be carrying rockets. Every bush could hide a gunner. Every ruined house could contain an anti-tank team. Every destroyed vehicle could conceal another weapon. The tank must keep moving. But movement exposes it. The tank must slow down to identify targets. But slowing down makes it easier to hit. This is the tactical dilemma created by portable anti-tank weapons. The weapon didn't need to destroy every tank. It simply needed to make every tank commander afraid of getting too close. And fear changes behavior. The battle of ideas, the story of the bazooka and Panzerschreck, is therefore not simply about one country copying another. It's about how war turns innovation into a cycle. America develops. Germany observes. Germany adapts. America improves. Germany responds. And the process continues. The battlefield becomes a feedback loop. One side fires. The other side studies the result. One side develops armor. The other side develops a better warhead. One side improves the tank. The other side improves the launcher. One side adds protection. The other side changes tactics. This is the arms race at its most basic level. And World War II accelerated it at a terrifying speed. A technology that might have taken decades to mature in peacetime could be redesigned in months. A battlefield discovery could reach factories thousands of miles away. An enemy weapon could become the blueprint for your own. And sometimes the result was better than the original. Why the story still matters. Today, portable anti-armor weapons are common around the world. Modern systems may use advanced guidance. They may have sophisticated sights. They may use tandem warheads designed to defeat reactive armor. Some can attack armored vehicles from above. Some are capable of enormous ranges. The technology has advanced dramatically, but the basic concept remains recognizable. A soldier carries a launcher. A projectile carries its own propulsion. The warhead attacks the armor. The operator doesn't need a massive cannon. That idea can be traced through generations of weapons. And somewhere in that lineage is the humble World War II bazooka. A weapon that could look almost primitive compared with the tanks it was designed to fight. Yet primitive-looking technology can be strategically important. Because sometimes the greatest innovation isn't making something more complicated. It's making something powerful enough to solve a problem while remaining simple enough for one person to carry. The Panzerschreck's final years. As the war moved toward its final year, Germany was fighting an increasingly desperate battle. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east. German cities were being bombed. Industrial capacity was collapsing. Fuel shortages were crippling mobility. Yet German infantry continued to receive anti-tank weapons. The Panzerschreck remained part of the defensive arsenal, but it was now fighting inside a larger strategic disaster. A powerful anti-tank launcher could destroy a tank, could not stop an entire army. It could not replace fuel. It could not create air superiority. It could not manufacture enough trucks. It could not repair destroyed railroads. And it could not reverse the balance of industrial production. This is another lesson from military technology. A brilliant weapon can solve a tactical problem. It cannot automatically solve a strategic one. Germany could build an impressive infantry anti-tank rocket, but the war was being decided by much larger forces. Factories, transportation, manpower, air power, logistics, and production. The Panzerschreck was dangerous. But Germany's strategic situation was becoming impossible. The American industrial advantage. The United States approached the same war from a dramatically different position. American industry was producing vast numbers of weapons. The United States could experiment with multiple designs. Some would fail. Others would be produced in limited numbers. A few would become standards. This industrial flexibility mattered. The American military could field specialized weapons without making every weapon perfect. That was one of the strengths of American wartime production. The country could build tanks and trucks and aircraft while also producing relatively specialized infantry systems. The bazooka was one example. And the weapon became part of a much larger ecosystem of American firepower. Artillery, aircraft, tanks, infantry, engineers, communications, logistics. Each component strengthened the others. The bazooka was powerful because the soldier carrying it was supported by an enormous military system. The rocket launcher as a force multiplier. A force multiplier is a capability that allows a relatively small number of people to have an effect disproportionate to their size. The bazooka was exactly that kind of weapon. A two-man team could potentially threaten a tank. That didn't mean every tank would be destroyed. It meant the infantry squad now had an anti-armor capability that could influence how enemy armor operated. The Panzerschreck did the same thing for German troops. The weapon gave infantry a degree of independence. They didn't have to wait for a tank destroyer. They didn't have to wait for artillery. They had an option in their own hands. That was the revolution. Not the rocket itself. Not the tube. Not the explosive. The revolution was putting anti-armor power directly into the infantry squad. The moment the Germans realized. So imagine the moment German engineers examined a captured American launcher. Perhaps there was no dramatic laughter. Perhaps there was no cinematic scene where officers mocked the weapon and then suddenly changed their minds. Real military innovation rarely works like that. Instead, there may have been something much more dangerous. Curiosity. What is this? How does it work? What does the rocket do? How thick is the armor penetration? How accurate is it? How far can it reach? Can we manufacture it? Can we make it stronger? Those questions are more important than laughter. Because once engineers start asking those questions, the enemy's weapon has already achieved something. It has entered their thinking. And soon, an American idea was becoming a German weapon. From bazooka to Panzerschreck. The transformation can be summarized simply. America developed a portable rocket launcher. German forces encountered it. German engineers studied the technology. Germany developed a larger rocket launcher using the same basic principle. The Panzerschreck entered service. And Allied tank crews now faced a new threat. That is the core of the story. But the deeper lesson is even more interesting. The Germans didn't defeat the bazooka by proving it was useless. They answered it by acknowledging that the concept worked. Then they built their own. That is how military technology evolves. Not through pride. Through adaptation. The humiliation of copying? There is sometimes a strange idea that copying an enemy weapon represents weakness. History says otherwise. Every major military has borrowed ideas. Nations copy aircraft designs, tank layouts, armor concepts, ammunition, optics, engines, rocket technology, even uniforms and battlefield tactics. Because when a technology works, ideology becomes irrelevant. The question isn't, who invented it? The question is, does it work? And if the answer is yes, the enemy will notice. That is exactly what happened here. The bazooka didn't need to conquer Germany. It simply needed to demonstrate a useful concept. Germany did the rest. The weapon that made armor afraid. The true legacy of the bazooka wasn't the number of tanks it destroyed. Its legacy was what it did to the battlefield. It changed the relationship between infantry and armor. A tank could no longer treat infantry as helpless. Infantry could fight back. A soldier carrying a rocket launcher could become a serious threat to an armored vehicle. And that idea would survive long after 1945. The Panzerschreck reinforced the same lesson. Armor alone was not enough. Tanks needed infantry support. Infantry needed anti-tank weapons. The battlefield was becoming increasingly interconnected. The age of the lone tank charging ahead was becoming more dangerous. Combined arms was becoming essential. The sound that told everyone. There was something terrifying about rocket weapons that went beyond their explosive power. Sound. A rocket launch was unmistakable. The ignition. The blast. The smoke. The projectile streaking toward its target. The noise could reveal the position of the gunner. But it also announced that the tank was under attack. For the crew, that sound could mean seconds mattered. For nearby infantry, it could mean the battle was about to change. The rocket launcher turned a hidden infantryman into an artillery piece for one brief moment. Then the weapon had to disappear again. Fire. Move. Hide. Reload. Wait. Repeat. That rhythm became part of anti-tank warfare. The human side. It is easy to talk about weapons as machines. A tube. A rocket. A warhead. A tank. But every weapon eventually returns to a human being. The soldier carrying the launcher. The soldier loading the rocket. The commander inside the tank. The infantryman trying to protect the armored vehicle. The mechanic repairing the equipment. The factory worker producing the ammunition. The truck driver moving the rockets forward. Technology doesn't fight alone. People do. And the bazooka and Panzerschreck were designed around that human reality. They gave ordinary soldiers extraordinary destructive capability. But they also placed those soldiers in extraordinary danger. What the Germans really copied. The Germans didn't simply copy a tube. They copied an idea. The idea that an infantryman could carry a rocket-powered weapon capable of attacking armor. That distinction is crucial. Because ideas are harder to defeat than individual weapons. Destroy one launcher. Another can be produced. Capture one soldier. Another can be trained. Destroy one factory. The design can survive. The most important thing the Americans demonstrated was not a particular piece of hardware. It was a new way of thinking about infantry anti-tank warfare. And once that idea existed, it was impossible to erase. The legacy after 1945. World War II ended in 1945. But portable anti-tank weapons did not disappear. They became more important. The Cold War produced enormous armored formations. NATO planned for Soviet tanks. The Soviet Union planned for NATO armor. Every infantry formation needed ways to defend itself against tanks. Rocket launchers evolved. Recoilless rifles evolved. Anti-tank guided missiles appeared. And eventually, systems became capable of attacking armored vehicles from increasingly sophisticated angles. The basic principle remained. Give infantry a weapon capable of threatening armor. That concept was now permanent. The bazooka had helped establish it. The Panzerschreck proved how quickly an enemy could adapt to it. The real lesson. So did German crews really laugh at the American rocket launcher? Maybe some soldiers did. Soldiers laugh at strange-looking weapons all the time. But the larger claim, that German troops universally mocked the bazooka before realizing its value, should be treated as a dramatic simplification. The historical evidence supports something more interesting. The Germans recognized the value of the American system quickly enough to develop their own weapon. And their answer was not a joke. It was the Panzerschreck, a larger, powerful rocket launcher that became a major German infantry anti-tank weapon. The Germans didn't laugh the idea away. They learned from it. And that may be the most important part of the entire story. When the enemy teaches you, war forces enemies to become unwilling teachers. Every battlefield mistake teaches the other side. Every successful weapon becomes a target for study. Every captured piece of equipment can reveal something. And every new technology creates a response. The Americans learned from German armor. The Germans learned from American weapons. The Soviets learned from German engineering. The British learned from battlefield experience. Everyone was learning. Because in a global war, information moves almost as quickly as weapons. A captured launcher can cross a continent. A technical report can reach a laboratory. A photograph can inspire an engineer. A battlefield observation can become a factory blueprint. And months later, the enemy may be facing his own idea turned against him. The simple tube. In the end, the bazooka looked almost too simple. That was the point. It wasn't supposed to be a giant piece of artillery. It wasn't supposed to compete with a tank's main gun. It wasn't supposed to replace every anti-tank weapon. It was designed to give infantry a chance. A chance to fight back. A chance to stop armor. A chance to survive. And that simple concept proved powerful enough to influence the enemy. The Germans took that concept, made the weapon larger, added their own engineering solutions, and created the Panzerschreck. 2 weapons, 2 armies, 1 basic idea. The rocket launcher had become a permanent part of modern warfare. Picture the battlefield again. A German tank is moving along a road. The crew cannot see everything. Somewhere nearby, an American infantryman is holding a bazooka. Or perhaps the direction is reversed. An American Sherman is moving through a European village. Somewhere behind a wall, a German soldier is waiting with a Panzerschreck. Neither side can see the other yet. The tank keeps moving. The soldier waits. The distance closes. The world becomes silent for a moment. Then the launcher fires. A rocket crosses the space between infantry and armor. And in that instant, decades of engineering, industrial production, battlefield experience, and human courage collide. That is the real story. Not a joke. Not simply a copy. Not merely a bigger tube. It is the story of how one battlefield idea crossed enemy lines and returned as a weapon of its own. The Americans created the bazooka. The Germans studied it. Then they built the Panzerschreck. And the tank crews of World War II learned a lesson that would remain true for generations. Armor can be powerful. But armor is never alone. Because somewhere in the battlefield darkness, there may always be a soldier carrying a rocket. The weapon that outlived the war. The Second World War eventually ended. The factories stopped. The armies went home. The tanks were parked. The surviving soldiers returned to civilian life. But the technology remained. The rocket launcher had proven its value. The idea was too useful to disappear. It would evolve into new weapons. New armies would use them. New wars would test them. And new generations of soldiers would learn the same fundamental lesson. A tank is a machine. A rocket launcher is a machine. But the battlefield is decided by people who understand how to use machines against one another. The bazooka demonstrated that a single infantry team could carry anti-tank power. The Panzerschreck demonstrated that an enemy could study that concept and rapidly develop a response. That cycle of innovation never stopped. It continues today. One side creates a new weapon. The other creates a countermeasure. Then the first side adapts again. The technology changes. The principle remains. The last lesson. There is a temptation when studying World War II to divide weapons into winners and losers. American weapons. German weapons. Soviet weapons. British weapons. But technology doesn't respect national borders. A good idea can be captured. A useful design can be copied. A battlefield lesson can spread from one army to another. The bazooka story proves it. The Germans didn't need to admire the weapon. They didn't need to like it. They only needed to understand that it worked. And once they understood that, they built their own. That is perhaps the most powerful lesson in military innovation. The enemy doesn't have to surrender before you learn from him. Sometimes the enemy teaches you by shooting at you. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate a weapon simply because it looks simple. Because the weapon that looks like a tube today can become the blueprint for tomorrow's battlefield. Epilogue. The American bazooka began as a solution to a simple problem. Infantry needed a way to fight tanks. The solution was a rocket. A rocket needed a launcher. The launcher had to be light. The soldier had to carry it. And the weapon had to work. It did. Not perfectly. Not magically. But well enough to matter. German forces encountered the technology. They understood its potential. And they created the Panzerschreck. The German weapon became larger, more powerful, more imposing, and more dangerous. The story is often remembered as a moment when German soldiers laughed at an American weapon, only to discover that the Americans had accidentally created something worth copying. The historical reality is less cinematic and more revealing. The Germans were already experts in rocket warfare. They weren't strangers to the technology. What the American bazooka demonstrated was how that technology could be placed directly into the hands of infantry. That was the innovation. And the Germans responded. Not with laughter. With engineering. Not with dismissal. With adaptation. Not by pretending the American idea didn't work, but by building their own version. That is why this story matters. Because the greatest weapon isn't always the biggest weapon. Sometimes it's the idea behind the weapon. And once an idea proves itself on the battlefield, the enemy may become its next engineer. The American bazooka changed the equation between infantry and armor. The German Panzerschreck proved that the equation could be copied, modified, and returned. And for tank crews across Europe, that meant one thing. The battlefield had become a place where any soldier might be dangerous. A tank could dominate a road. A tank could destroy a building. A tank could survive machine gun fire. But a tank could never completely escape the infantry. Because infantry had learned to carry rockets. And once that happened, the age of the tank being safe from the ordinary soldier was over. The tube had won. The rocket had arrived. And the enemy had learned. The next time you see an old photograph of a World War II soldier holding what looks like nothing more than a metal pipe, remember what you're looking at. You're not looking at a toy. You're looking at a turning point. A weapon simple enough for one soldier to carry. Powerful enough to threaten armor. Important enough for the enemy to copy. And influential enough to leave a legacy that still exists on battlefields decades later. The Americans called it the bazooka. The Germans answered with the Panzerschreck. And somewhere between those two weapons, modern infantry anti-armor warfare was born. Because in war, the most dangerous mistake isn't always failing to build the best weapon. Sometimes it's laughing at the weapon you don't understand. And by the time you understand it, your enemy may already have built the next one. If you want more stories about the weapons, battles, and impossible engineering decisions that shaped World War II, subscribe to the channel. Because history isn't just about who won. It's about how they adapted. And sometimes, the most important weapon on the battlefield begins with something that looks almost too simple to matter. A tube, a rocket, and an idea. That was the bazooka. And this was the moment the Germans learned to fear it.